Today, we'll be discussing the case of Joe Bartnik and Donato Danny Gianotto. Now, Joe and Danny did not know each other. I mean, they were living pretty different lives. Joe was living in Texas, Danny lived in New York and then New Jersey. They worked different jobs. They hadn't even met each other when all of this started. But regardless if they had similar lives or not, there was one thing that these two men did in fact have in common. And the worst part of it all was for many months and even years, they didn't even know it. Nothing was more shocking for Danny than when he received a DUI charge one night while driving. Because yes, he was driving really fast and he was swerving in and out of lanes, and his breath alcohol level was in fact well over the legal driving limit. He was arrested and charged with the DUI that night, and certainly the police were just glad to get another drunk driver off of the streets. But the thing is, Danny hadn't touched a bottle of alcohol that night. He hadn't touched a bottle of alcohol that week. In fact, he hadn't even touched a bottle of alcohol in years. But somehow, as he drove that car and was taken to the police station, he just so happened to be very much intoxicated with no explanation why. And as similar incidents occurred for Joe, these two men would both endure years of accusations by acquaintances, by peers, and even by doctors of secretly hiding their alcohol consumption. That, of course, wasn't until they made a shocking discovery. There was something way deeper happening with both of these men, and everybody, even doctors, were baffled to find out what was really going on. But before we get into today's case, just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. All right, let's get into this case. Joe Bartnik was a registered nurse working in the cardiac catheterization lab. He lived in Carthage, Texas, alongside his wife Barbara Cordell and son Brendan. Barbara, too, was a registered nurse in cardiac care, and after working as an RN for many years, she soon earned a master's nursing administration, which was quickly followed by her doctorate. Barbara and Joe were said to enjoy time outdoors, traveling and doing fun activities like scuba diving. During U.S. Thanksgiving on November 27, 2003, many families were coming together to spend time with each other for the holiday. And this is what Joe and Barbara had planned to do as well. They were going to head to Barbara's sister-in-law's house for dinner that evening. And so when evening rolled around, they headed to her house, and once they arrived inside, they were greeted by their family. As they waited for dinner, Joe and Barbara sat down and were just chatting with family. But after some time of chatting had gone by, Joe suddenly began to act a bit odd. While in mid-conversation, he began to slur his words. Now, this was quite noticeable to the family. It was obvious that he was slurring his words, but what was extremely obvious was when Joe began to feel sleepy. After continuing to slur words while looking as if he was about to doze off, Joe's eyes slowly shut. His head went back and he fell right asleep in that chair he was sitting in. At that point, everyone began asking Barbara, like, hey, is anything wrong? But Barbara was like, no, there's nothing wrong that I know of. She was just as confused as they were. And an entire hour had went by of Joe sleeping in that chair and snoring very loudly before he woke up, seemingly feeling fine. When he woke up, he got out of the chair and headed to the dinner table. Now, once he sat down at that dinner table with his family, he seemed pretty okay. He ate dinner as normal. He was speaking just fine. Maybe he was just tired and that nap was everything he needed to get his energy back. And so once dinner was done and they finished up for the evening, Joe and Barbara headed back to their home to end off the night. Now, Joe was about 55 years old around this time, and with being a nurse as well as Barbara, he and Barbara kept a good eye on their health. So it was quite noticeable when something was off or something was happening with their health. And it especially became a concern when an incident like this actually happened again, and not just once, but multiple times. Whenever springtime rolled around, it's common for people to do some yard work or do a spring cleanup. So it was no surprise that on one Saturday in May 2004, Joe and Barbara had decided to do some yard work. Now, when they finished their work, they headed in to grab a beer. They each took just one beer and they went to sit on the patio to enjoy it. Now, Barbara and Joe had some plans for the night out. Joe had planned to drive them to dinner and then to go see a movie. And so after some time had gone by, the two of them had gotten into the car and headed out on their date night. During the first few minutes of their ride, everything was normal. They were chatting, they knew where they were going, everyone was okay. But just about 30 minutes into their drive, Barbara began noticing that Joe was speeding, and he was having a very hard time staying in his lane. So as the car was moving really fast and swerving in and out of the lane, Barbara was feeling extremely concerned. So she was like, "Hey, Joe, is everything okay? Like, what's going on?" But it was at that point, Joe just turned his head to look directly at Barbara, and while slurring his words, he told her, "I'm fine." But it was painfully obvious that Joe was not fine, because not only was he driving erratically and slurring his words, but when he turned his head to look at her, all she saw clear as day was his foggy, red eyes, slack jaw, and bright skin. It was painfully obvious that Joe was drunk, and Barbara was terrified. She became frantic, and she was screaming for Joe to slow down and pull over. Beside her was her drunk husband driving his car, and who's to say how much longer it'd be before he loses control of it. Fortunately, though, Joe began to pull the car over. He parked the cars and he gave the keys to Barbara for her to drive instead. Now, I would describe how the rest of the night went, but Joe just seemed to be so intoxicated. The next day, he couldn't recall anything that happened that night. And so when he and Barbara began talking, she told him that she wanted him to see a doctor. She was thinking that Joe might have been dealing with hypoglycemia, aka low blood sugar, or at least something similar. It's commonly known that very low blood sugar or very high blood sugar can cause a person to act drunk. And so she told him, like, "Hey, I think you should really get checked out by a doctor," especially because these episodes were not over. In fact, after this point, Barbara noticed that the episodes started becoming closer together. Over the summer of 2004, Joe was on a diving trip in Mexico. However, while there, he ended up suffering a seizure, and so he was taken to see a physician there. Now, the doctors there thought the seizure Joe had was caused by hyperthermia, and when Joe returned home, he underwent extensive testing. He had neurological testing done, a cardiac ultrasound, and a tilt table. However, every test came back negative, so the hyperthermia hypothesis did make sense. I mean, Mexico, especially in the summer, is hot and the testing was all negative, so hypothermia did make sense. However, this was not the end, because the strange symptoms just continued to occur. One day, Barbara and Joe had been spending an evening together. Earlier in the day, Joe did have 2 beers, but since then, he did not have any. Now, after a few hours had gone by, Joe went to use the bathroom, but he'd been in there for quite a bit, so Barbara went by the bathroom, and when she looked inside, Joe was fumbling all over the place and peeing directly on the floor. And so Barbara quickly helped Joe get to a chair, and she was like, "What's going on? Like, what's going on? Are you okay?" And as she was asking this, Joe tried replying to her, but he couldn't make out any words to respond. And it was at that point Barbara decided to call an ambulance, and they shortly arrived to pick him up. This was the first time Joe had visited the emergency room for one of these incidents, and Barbara was growing more and more concerned about his blood sugar. The thing is, though, when she arrived at the hospital, she was told the results of the tests that were ran on Joe, and she was surprised to hear that his blood sugar was actually normal. However, they found that his blood alcohol concentration was a 0.28%. Now, across the United States, 0.08% is the legal limit for driving under the influence. Joe was a whole 3.5 times above the legal limit. His blood alcohol level was so high that he actually was treated for alcohol poisoning. And Barbara was in disbelief. It was clear he only drank 2 beers in front of her. She started thinking, was he possibly drinking more and not telling her? The thought of him hiding alcohol from her seemed impossible, but she didn't have any other explanation for how he'd gotten so drunk. And she had to accept the reality that maybe Joe was in fact drinking too much and hiding it from her. And so when she arrived home, she searched the house extensively. She checked the bottles they kept to see if they'd been diluted. She went through the garage and went through Joe's truck. She went through the trash, and she even checked their bank account for unexpected charges. But after doing all this searching, she found that there was no evidence of hidden alcohol consumption. Unless he was just really good at hiding his trail and was able to keep up with doing this, there was no explanation for why Joe was getting so drunk, and constantly too. Joe began snoring louder than normal. He was having trouble remembering the previous day's events more often, and Barbara and their family and friends were noticing that Joe would have these episodes where he was fine one moment, but in the next, he would be completely different. Even at work, his coworkers began noticing major changes in Joe. In fact, they actually began offering him food because they genuinely thought that his wooziness might have been from low blood sugar. And episodes like this continue to occur. One Easter, Barbara and Joe headed down to their pastor's house to have lunch with their fellow church members. Both Barbara and Joe had driven their own cars to get to the pastor's house, and they were going to be meeting up when they got there at the home. Once they arrived, they shortly began eating lunch. Now, while eating, everything was fine and Joe was drinking some alcohol. However, a short time later, Joe began stumbling while standing, and he ended up falling off of the pastor's porch. And after this happened, he needed to be driven home. Because they'd both driven their own car, they coordinated with the others to get both of their cars back to their house. And Barbara and Joe shortly headed back to their home. The pastor's daughters were so concerned with this incident from Joe because it just seemed so out of character for him. But Joe just figured that he drank too much at lunch, and he was mortified at what happened. So after all these episodes that continued to occur, Barbara had decided to buy a breathalyzer for Joe, and she made sure that it was legit. The one she got had been approved by the Texas Department of Transportation, and she made sure that whenever Joe had an episode, that she would begin to record his breath alcohol concentration levels. Not only was she checking his breath alcohol levels, but if they could recall, she also began logging what he had eaten prior, and the results they were getting during some of these episodes were absolutely shocking. There were some episodes Joe's breath alcohol concentration would reach as high as 0.4%. That's 5 times the legal limit. And it's a level so high, it would likely knock most people unconscious. Now, this was a legit breathalyzer, but especially with how high the levels were getting, there is a reasonable thought that there could be possible errors with the device. And so one night, the couple had decided to do an experiment. On this night, Barbara and Joe were joined by their son, Brendan, and a friend, and they had planned to take turns testing out the breathalyzer. At that point in the night, none of them had drank alcohol, and so they started off with each other blowing on the breathalyzer without drinking anything to see the results they would get. And as they expected, they each got a 0. Now, what they did next was each of them had drank a single serving of alcohol, and they were going to wait 30 minutes before trying the breathalyzer again. Now, Barbara blew a 0.04, her friend blew a 0.03, and Brendan blew a 0.02. Now, all of them were well under the legal driving limit for being under the influence. However, Joe blew a whopping 0.14, almost double the legal limit, and this was just 30 minutes after drinking 1 serving of alcohol. Everyone was shocked by the large increase, and they could just tell that there was something going on with Joe. As more of these incidents continued to occur, Barbara was growing more concerned for Joe's safety. These incidents had the potential to put him in some very dangerous situations, especially when he was driving alone. In one incident, Barbara came home on a cold winter night to find Joe chest deep in lake water next to the bulkhead at their house. And as he laid there in that water, he was unsure how he even got there or how to get out. Barbara had to sprint to go grab a ladder and help him out of the water. And while he did manage to get out safely, she ended up giving him a warm shower because the next concern was making sure he didn't get hypothermia. And again, in the morning, Joe had very little recognition of what had happened that night. The only thing he was able to recall was the feeling of the cold water. Mind you, these incidents started in 2003, but it wasn't until there was this one particular incident that happened in 2009 when Joe and Barbara finally got some answers. One day in November 2009, Joe had become glossy-eyed, and he began stumbling in a store while shopping. And because of this, Barbara and a store employee both had to assist Joe to the car. Once they arrived at the car and got all situated, Barbara was like, "Hey, can you pass me the keys?" However, Joe kept trying to give the keys to the store employee as Barbara continued to ask him for it. It got to the point where all of this was finally getting to Barbara. And so out of frustration and desperation, once she got the keys, she brought Joe into the emergency room. Now, when he got there, his blood alcohol level was 0.378. And because it was so high, they quickly transferred him into the ICU for treatment and placed him on a 24-hour observation period. Now, Joe's episodes may sound strange, but they're not as unique as you may think. Many people have actually had similar experiences that go unexplained. In fact, we will dive into another person's story, Gianotto Danny Gianotto met a woman named Michelle on Facebook through a mutual friend in 2013. Throughout that year, Danny and Michelle would chat fairly consistently, and they discovered they actually had a lot in common. The two noticed that they had an undeniable spark together, and it took until a year later in 2014 when they met in person. But after that, they were inseparable. Danny and Michelle continued dating, and just a few short months later, Danny had proposed to Michelle, and she said yes. Now, as they prepared for their faithful vows of in sickness and health, they were forced to see what that really meant, because their love was in fact put to the test while they were still engaged. In 2015, Michelle had to undergo an important surgery. Fortunately, though, it went successfully, and Danny was there to take care of her afterwards. In the following weeks, Danny provided all the care and all the support he could while Michelle recovered, and she fortunately was able to make a full recovery. However, it wasn't long until Danny needed a surgery of his own. In September of 2015, Danny underwent a routine nasal surgery to repair a deviated septum after previously breaking his nose. And like Danny did for Michelle, she was there to help him while he was in his post-operative recovery. He was doing just fine at first, but things did take a sharp turn when suddenly one day Danny woke up feeling severe pain in his head. Now, because it was hurting so bad, they tried doing some at-home pain relief, but this was not helping, and his head was progressively getting more and more painful. That's when they contacted Danny's doctor, and he was advised to meet him at the emergency room for further evaluation. At the ER, a CAT scan showed that Danny developed a very serious post-operative infection, and they had to admit him to the hospital to begin treatment immediately. They pumped Danny full of antibiotics, and this fortunately did help him start to feel better. And so once Danny was stable enough, he was discharged from the hospital and was sent home with a prescription for oral steroid antibiotics to continue taking. This was with the hope that the antibiotics would put an end to all the pain he was feeling. But unfortunately for Danny, this was not the case. He was not getting better. If anything, he seemed to be getting worse, because after about a month of consistently taking these antibiotics, Danny had an incident where he started to feel extremely and unusually sick. He was very tired. He started to slur his words, he started vomiting, and he felt so weak that he could barely get up and walk. And Michelle was very concerned, especially as time went on, these symptoms continued to occur. Sometimes Danny would feel fine and go into work early, and he would be relaxing in his car with a coffee. However, he would just fall straight asleep in his car, and nobody would even realize that he was passed out in his car and missed work. And Danny was afraid something like that could happen while he was driving. Eventually, one day, Michelle asked Danny to move in with her because she especially wanted to be able to keep a much closer eye on him. She wanted to be readily available if his symptoms worsened, and so Danny agreed, and he promptly moved into Michelle's home. This, at the very least, gave them both some peace of mind knowing that Michelle would be there whenever Danny was at his worst, especially because the symptoms actually did, in fact, get worse. One day, about 2 months following his surgery, Danny woke up and he tried getting out of bed, but as he laid there, he was so fatigued, he was unable to get up. For the rest of the day, all he could manage through the fatigue was getting up whenever he had to use the bathroom and getting up to eat. But after he got both of these done, he would go straight back to sleep and fall asleep in his bed immediately too. This became a cycle for him that lasted 3 whole days. Just restroom, eat, sleep, restroom, eat, sleep. It got so bad to the point Michelle decided it was time to call the doctors again. So on that 3rd day, she called and she explained to them, look, Danny's not doing too well. He'd been sleeping for days straight. What should we do? However, to her dismay, the doctor suggested another trip to the hospital for evaluation. Because the thing is, she had already been taking him to the hospital on multiple occasions during that time. Over the span of 2 months, she took him to several doctors in several different cities and in several states. However, it became painfully obvious that none of these doctors had any idea of what was going on with Danny, and they had no inclination to help. Essentially, Danny and Michelle were going to these appointments and they were leaving feeling even more confused than when they came in, because no medical professional had a single clue of what was going on with Danny. And it continued getting worse. On October 31st, 2015, so on Halloween, Michelle and Danny invited their friends over for dinner and to pass out candy. And even though it'd been months, Danny was still struggling to get out of bed. Throughout the evening, his friends would wake him up, walk him to the table. Danny would struggle to eat and chat, and he'd go back to bed. And this repeated while the group of friends tried to share some of the leftover candy. They were concerned because they'd never seen Danny like that. But for Michelle, this had become their everyday life since the surgery. It was at that point Michelle started to break down because she was just so overwhelmed. Danny couldn't even enjoy a holiday with friends without feeling extremely fatigued and needing to sleep throughout. And they reached a turning point that next day that would change everything. That next morning, Michelle woke up and she didn't know why, but she just had this strong instinct to stay home. She just had a feeling that she needed to stay home and make sure that Danny was okay. And so instead of getting up and heading out for the day, she took a shower, she changed into her nightgown, and she sat in the kitchen while Danny slept in the bedroom. As Michelle was sitting in the kitchen, not long had passed by when she began hearing a strange cough coming from the bedroom. And at that point, Michelle sprinted inside to find Danny on his back, seizing and choking on his own vomit. She quickly rolled Danny onto his side and he continued to profusely vomit. So frantically, Michelle ran to grab the phone and call 911. And as she was dialing 911, Danny laid on the floor in front of her, just looking ill. And once they answered, Michelle explained, "Hey, my husband was sleeping just fine 1 second. Now he's seizing and throwing up. What should I do? Please get here soon." Once the paramedics finally arrived, Michelle explained what was going on and they quickly loaded him onto a stretcher and took him to the hospital. As Danny was being tended to, Michelle took that time to call his family, her friends, to not just inform them of Danny's worsening condition, but to get some emotional support herself. She was absolutely distraught seeing Danny in that state and knowing that they took so many efforts to try getting him better, yet these efforts were to no avail. Danny was shortly placed in the intensive care unit where they restrained him and put many leads and tubes in his body. And when he woke up, he was confused. He had no memory of the ambulance ride, obviously. He had no memory of the seizure, too. And Michelle called Danny's family so they knew he was in the ICU and they all came to visit him and say goodbye just in case. Danny was admitted to stay in the ICU for a week, and that week was a very frustrating one for him because, like Joe, Danny's blood alcohol levels too indicated that he was intoxicated. And the doctors determined that Danny was suffering from alcohol withdrawal. And even though Danny assured them, "Look, I haven't even drank alcohol in years," throughout this day, the doctors continuously accused him of being drunk. They kept on asking him, "Did you drink anything? Are you sure you didn't drink anything? I think you drank something. You must have drunk something." Even as adamant as he was, they did not believe him. It was clear that he was suffering from alcohol withdrawal, so he must have been drinking and not telling them the truth. The hospital ran many tests. They looked at blood work, EKGs, CAT scans, chest x-rays, sonograms, anything that had been previously tested, they looked at to try to figure out what was happening to Danny. But they couldn't find anything, and they concluded that this was all just from alcohol withdrawal and told Danny that there was nothing else that they could do about it. Now, Michelle was fuming. Over the past 2 months, they've already taken these tests multiple times and they've always been the same. She was so angry that after all this time, the hospital still wasn't taking them seriously and listening to them, that there was something deeper going on. The doctors shortly ended up discharging Danny from the hospital, and Michelle thought that if they weren't going to pay attention to all the symptoms he was having, she was going to have to do it herself. She began keeping a logbook of all of Danny's symptoms. She was keeping paperwork, medical test results. She didn't want the doctors to keep running the same test, so she kept the records and she made sure that they moved forward without always starting again at square one, especially because these symptoms did not stop. On Christmas Eve 2015, Michelle and Danny had gone to his mother's house for a family dinner. The night seemed to go fine. However, around midnight, Danny's mother heard some noises that soon woke her up. And when she went to check on what was going on, she found Danny on the floor of the bathroom having a seizure, and she immediately called 911. As time went on, these symptoms and the episodes continued to worsen. Danny was in such poor health that he had to be put on a 24/7 oxygen with a BiPAP. And at night, his resting oxygen while awake was a 74, and his oxygen while sleeping was a 66. This is a stark difference from the required 98 to 100 oxygen that people should be at. Still, no one knew what was wrong with Danny. So, what was really wrong with these men? Both Joe and Danny had these sort of episodes. Danny's episodes seemed to consist of fatigue, seizures, and blackouts, whereas Joe's consisted of confusion, loss of coordination, and memory loss. On the surface, all of these symptoms could be linked to intoxication, but the people close to them knew that they were not suffering from alcoholism. This had to be something else. For Joe, an answer appeared during that last ER trip that we mentioned. In November 2009, while Joe was in the ICU, their friend and deacon, Susan Rushing, was on her way to the hospital to visit, and she probably wanted to get there quickly because she had some information to tell them. When Susan got into Joe's room, they talked for a bit, and eventually Susan was like, "Hey, guess what? I was actually searching on the internet the other day, and I came across this term called Auto-Brewery. I really think you should search this up. It sounds awfully similar to what you're dealing with." Auto-Brewery was something that Joe had never heard of, nor Barbara. And so, as soon as she could, Barbara got to doing her own research and realized, oh snap, this might be it. Joe needs to go see a doctor. And that is exactly what he did. Joe agreed to visit a gastroenterologist named Dr. Justin McCarthy, and he and Dr. McCarthy actually used to work at the same hospital together. In January 2010, Joe finally went to see Dr. McCarthy, and when he got there, he had Joe undergo many tests. The first thing they did was a complete medical history. Joe did have high blood pressure that wasn't well controlled, but there was no other notable things in his medical history. They then tested his breath for lactose and fructose intolerance. They tested his breath for hydrogen, and they also gave Joe a glucose tolerance test. All these tests were negative. Joe then underwent a liver scan, a biopsy, a colonoscopy, and they even went to perform an esophagogastroduodenoscopy, or an EGD. During the colonoscopy, they took a sample from his stomach, and when they got the results back, they found out that his stomach contained a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. They also had him do a stool sample, and from those results, they discovered that he had a rare budding yeast and a fungus called Sacaromyces ceraviseae. And guess what is interesting about this particular fungus? It is also known as brewer's yeast. Now, how on earth is that even relevant? Well, alcohol, especially beer, is created through a process called brewing. This is when a starchy source is steeped in water, and the result that forms is a sweet liquid. Now, once that sweet liquid is formed, that's not the end of creating the alcohol, because the final step would then be to ferment that sweet liquid with what? Yeast. And if we're gonna put two and two together, I don't think it's not a coincidence that a man who appeared to be intoxicated on several different occasions just so happened to have a fungus called brewer's yeast in his stool. So finding this out was a critical step in figuring out what was going on with Joe. Now, with just the stool sample result, they still didn't have enough direct proof to diagnose Joe with anything. And so in April 2010, he went to the hospital to undergo a period of observation and carbohydrate testing. When he arrived, they searched his belongings to check for the presence of any alcohol, and he was not allowed to have any visitors during this test. They tried making sure that the environment was kept as controlled as possible, and once he got in, they drew some blood from him to get a baseline blood alcohol level. Now, for this test, they made sure to give Joe a dose of glucose. They gave him continuous snacks that were high in carbohydrates, and every 2 hours, his blood was drawn to monitor his blood alcohol level. Additionally, his breath alcohol level was also taken with a breathalyzer every 4 hours. Throughout this period, Joe's blood alcohol level reached a high point of 0.12. Now, even though this wasn't even as close to what he had reached in the past, it was still well over the legal limit. But what's interesting is that that was probably the least thing they were worried about, because the real concern was the fact that even after almost 24 hours of consuming some carbs, Joe's blood alcohol level was still rising. And that was enough. This test and the rise in his blood alcohol levels were enough for Joe to finally be diagnosed. Dr. McCarthy fully agreed that Joe, in fact, had Auto-Brewery Syndrome. And thanks in part to Joe's story, Danny was able to get a diagnosis as well. During Thanksgiving weekend of 2016, Michelle was visiting her family. While chatting, they had asked her about Danny, and she ended up describing all of his symptoms. Now, Michelle's cousin and his wife both happened to be doctors, and they were listening intently as Michelle recounted the past year to them. At some point, Michelle was like, yeah, and the doctors think he has alcohol withdrawal. And as soon as she said this, it immediately sparked an idea, because Michelle's cousin's wife had actually just attended a conference for rare and unusual medical conditions. And it was at this conference that Auto-Brewery Syndrome was a topic of discussion. So she was like, hey, this is actually what I just learned about the other day. And they decided to do a Google search to see what came up. And guess what happened? They ended up reading a publication by none other than Barbara Cordell, Joe's wife. Based on what they read, Danny fit the profile, and Michelle and Danny decided to then purchase a breathalyzer. Michelle then called Danny's pulmonologist and requested a referral to see a gastroenterologist as soon as possible. Fortunately, this urgency was passed on and an appointment was scheduled for just 2 days later. During those 2 days, Michelle researched and printed everything she could about Auto-Brewery Syndrome. She even joined Barbara's support group and spoke to them. And when they got to the appointment, although the gastroenterologist had never heard of ABS, unlike many others, he finally took Michelle and Danny seriously. Between the log of Danny's medical information and the printed research articles, they had so much information, it was hard not to be believed. On December 9th, 2016, Danny was admitted to the hospital, and like Joe, he underwent a carb test. Under strict supervision, he was given high-carb foods while his blood alcohol level was measured. And the rise in these levels told him and told his doctors that he, in fact, had ABS. After being hospitalized 22 times in such a short span of time, Danny was so relieved to finally have a diagnosis. Now, Auto-Brewery Syndrome, or ABS, is also known as gut fermentation syndrome, and it's a rare disorder where one's body produces alcohol, specifically ethanol, in their gut. This happens through the fermentation of carbs or sugars by yeast that lives in their gut. This means that when a person eats a meal high in carbs, such as bread, the yeast in their gut will convert the carbs within bread into ethanol. When this process occurs within the stomach or small intestine, a person will experience symptoms similar to typical alcohol intoxication because these areas are where alcohol is absorbed. These drunk symptoms can include dizziness, disorientation, and impaired motor skills. Just like typical drinking, these individuals may also slur their speech, they may vomit, they may have blurred vision, just many other symptoms. With this condition, there's mental changes that can happen suddenly with no event triggering them, and some people may even have GI issues such as bloating and IBS. And another interesting symptom they could have is the smell of alcohol also on their breath. In more serious cases, symptoms of alcohol poisoning or alcohol withdrawal may be noticed during different times depending on changes to a person's diet. Although the exact cause of ABS is still being researched and debated, it's clear that a generalized cause is an imbalance of the microbial species or the microorganisms in the intestinal area. When the natural microorganisms in someone's gut are disrupted, it can allow for another microorganism to take root and grow. When these microorganisms are able to cause fermentation, they will affect the way carbs and sugars are broken down by the body. In this case, yeast are the microorganisms causing the fermentation in the microbiome. For definition, microbiome essentially is just the community of microorganisms living in the body. So like fungi, bacteria, viruses, all of that. Yeast doesn't typically populate the gut microbiome, but when a disruption clears out the normal bacteria, they can swoop their way in. Like I described, yeast is also what causes fermentation when making beer and wine, or cheese and yogurt, or even some types of bread. Now, I'm about to go a little biochem on you. It's able to break down sugar into ethanol, which is the type of alcohol people drink. And while there are many different strains of yeast, fermentation in a commercial setting is usually done with the Sacaromyces cerevisiae, or the brewer's yeast strains, meaning The same yeast used commercially to create alcohol is the same yeast that was found in Joe's stool. And this also happens to be one of the most common strains of yeast found in cases of ABS. Now, Barbara, Joe, and Dr. McCarthy began talking and they were like, how did this even happen? How did Joe get such a rare condition? And that was when they actually recalled that weeks prior to all of this starting, Joe had actually gotten foot surgery. And after doing his surgery, he was given antibiotics, which he had to take for 3 weeks. So you know how I was saying in order for the yeast to grow in the gut, there has to be some type of disruption to the natural microorganisms that live in the gut? Well, this is where long-term antibiotic treatment comes into play. There has been found to be an association between ABS and long-term treatment with antibiotics. In fact, long-term antibiotic treatment is one of the most common causes of ABS. And what was the one thing that was common between both Joe and Danny? They both just so happened to be given long-term antibiotics after having completed surgery. Antibiotics are designed to treat different types of infections in different organs. However, they aren't quite targeted. Although some antibiotics may be better than others at treating different types of infections, they're not specialized to just one type of infection, and they will affect all microorganisms in some way. That's why a common side effect if you've ever taken antibiotics is diarrhea, because antibiotics have the tendency to disrupt the microbial species in the gut. And because of this, those, of course, doing longer term antibiotic treatments, and especially those using broad spectrum antibiotics, have a greater risk of larger impact. As for ABS, doctors and researchers have specifically mentioned the use of amoxicillin, cephalexin, and metronidazole being used for treatment lasting 3 weeks or longer before someone was diagnosed with ABS. And all of these antibiotics are what's called broad spectrum, meaning they act against both main groups of bacteria, the gram-positive groups and the gram-negative groups. Because they're so broad in what they treat, they will cause a greater impact on gut health. Now, it's not just antibiotics that can cause ABS. There are comorbidities that can lead to ABS too, such as diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease patients with strictures, short bowel syndrome, and immunosuppression. In all of these situations, there is an increased chance for gut health disruption. And although GI issues may be more clear to see the ABS risk, the increased sugar present in the body can cause trouble for patients with diabetes because having increased carbohydrates and sugars creates a better environment for the yeast to grow, since that's its main food source. And because sugar stays in the body longer without being broken down in patients with diabetes, they have an increased risk of yeast growing in their gut. It also goes to mention that a diet too rich in carbohydrates and sugars can also pose a risk. However, this typically won't be a problem without something additional to disrupt gut health. While ABS is a rare diagnosis in current medical practice, that doesn't mean that the syndrome is a rare occurrence overall. This is a condition that has been seen in women, it's been seen in men, and it's been seen in children. And it's widely believed that cases of ABS are happening more often than one would think, but that it's just underdiagnosed. That brings the question, if it is so common though, why are so few people properly diagnosed? Now, there are two main reasons that ABS is difficult to diagnose. One, the symptoms often overlap with other more common conditions, and two, the diagnosis process is time-consuming and non-standardized. Because ABS is intoxication due to alcohol and has the same symptoms as alcoholism, these two diagnoses can only be differentiated by observation for alcohol consumption. And because alcoholism can be closeted and hidden, to get a diagnosis, stricter isolation and observation in a hospital setting may be required. The GI symptoms associated with ABS can also often be misidentified as different conditions like IBS, and in less common cases, symptoms from ABS may even be misdiagnosed as a liver problem like liver dysfunction. In the diagnosis of ABS, it's pretty vital that they rule out other diagnoses diagnoses. Oftentimes, a full workup of tests are required to even rule everything out. And once those other conditions are finally out of the picture, ABS can be considered more seriously. Although there is not one specific test that definitively confirms ABS, the current recommendations are actually the two tests that Joe ended up completing. The first test was a gut and stool sample to check for any large amount of colonies, and the second being a carbohydrate test or a carb challenge to see any increases in blood alcohol level after consuming carbs. Once there is a noticeable rise in blood alcohol levels during the carb challenge and a fungi identified in gut samples, the diagnosis of ABS can then be made, and this diagnosis needs to be made by a medical professional. Because it is possible to do a preliminary carb challenge at home and figuring out alcohol levels by purchasing a breathalyzer, any results should be reported to a doctor so more official testing can take place. Typically, a gastroenterologist would be the ideal doctor to see. Now, there are many challenges that come for those with ABS. The people who suffer from Auto-Brewery Syndrome inadvertently have to suffer from society's view of alcoholism as well. Because Auto-Brewery Syndrome is not widely known about, or in some instances not believed to be real, these people are often treated as if they're addicted to alcohol. They can often suffer fates, including DUI charges, losing their jobs, and struggling with the interpersonal relationships. Take, for instance, the case of Mark Mongiardo. As a high school teacher and athletic coach, the smell of alcohol on his breath, to say the least, was quite concerning to everyone. When he told the school administrators that he had not been drinking, they did not believe him one bit, and they placed him on administrative leave. To everyone, he was just the teacher who was coming into work drunk around these kids at this school. And this forced him to get a new job. But like previously, this new job ultimately tested him for alcohol, and he was placed on administrative leave there as well. Mark was also charged with 2 DUIs during this time, and because of these charges, he was unable to find another job. There was nowhere to go. Even a grocery store wouldn't hire somebody with pending felony charges. And after all this, Mark was finally diagnosed with ABS. In another case, a 61-year-old woman was denied a liver transplant because of ABS. The woman was suffering from cirrhosis of the liver as well as poorly managed diabetes. Cirrhosis of the liver is a condition often associated with alcoholism, and she wanted to be placed on a wait list for a liver transplant. However, she had been denied previously because her urine tested positive for alcohol, and many hospitals will not allow those addicted to alcohol to receive organ transplants. Even though she adamantly told them she hadn't been drinking, the clinicians advised her to, instead of worrying about this liver transplant, worry about seeking treatment for alcohol addiction. Eventually, she was finally checked out one hospital that decided to look deeper into her claims, and they found that her blood did not contain any alcohol metabolites, but her urine contained alcohol. This was when she was diagnosed with urinary Auto-Brewery Syndrome, in which her bladder was producing alcohol. In our stories, Danny had a DUI of his own to deal with as well. In fall of 2016, Danny was driving one night when he was suddenly pulled over by a cop. The police officer thought Danny's driving suggested he may be under the influence, and so he had him take a breathalyzer. Once the officer saw his breath alcohol concentration, Danny was arrested on the spot and he was taken in for DUI. Once he was at the station and was able to contact Michelle, she immediately went to the police department and she tried explaining what they'd been going through those past few months. She described his symptoms and explained how Danny had just gotten out of the hospital, and they told her that she should try to take him back to another hospital. And she did just that. She took Danny in and they ran a few tests and found that Danny's blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. And as much as they questioned him, he adamantly denied that he was drinking. In fact, Danny told them that he hadn't drank alcohol in years, but the doctors were confused. They couldn't seem to believe him, and his DUI charge still stood. So while dealing with all the health issues, Michelle and Danny also had to deal with finding an attorney if they wanted to dispute the charge. Even in Joe's case, Barbara and Joe expressed that they felt shamed by others and embarrassed for what was going on. Oftentimes, even the physicians in the emergency room seemed to just assume Joe was addicted to alcohol, and once the assumption was made, they were treated a bit differently. Joe was lucky that Barbara believed him. For many couples, the appearance of alcoholism can be it for them. Auto-Brewery Syndrome could easily split up even the happiest couple. Part of the stigma is because Auto-Brewery Syndrome is not well known. Some doctors have never heard of ABS, and some who have don't even believe that it's real. Many doctors are skeptical of the diagnosis, and some think it may be just an excuse to get out of DUIs. There are also just some doctors that don't like the diagnosis because there isn't a single concrete diagnostic test for it. Like in these cases, when doing just routine testing, the results often come back normal, so it's easy for doctors to not believe there's anything wrong. That's a reason more research and publications are needed in order to raise awareness and provide scientific proof of the issue. Alcoholism is treated differently by society than any other mental illness. Often, people don't even consider alcoholism to be a mental illness, and society tends to blame the person. They assume they did it to themselves, and they even believe stereotypes that these people may be dangerous or dirty. Alcoholism is often associated with the homeless and criminals, and society greatly looks down upon those addicted to alcohol. Even when someone with alcoholism has recovered, they still face stigma. Saying you are sober and refusing a drink can cause awkwardness and judgment at social gatherings. Some jobs won't hire someone with a DUI on their record, even after they have gotten sober. People with ABS face the same stigma as those with alcohol addiction. Because people with ABS are experiencing the same symptoms as intoxication and testing with high blood alcohol levels, you can see from these cases that they are treated like those with alcohol addiction. Society's treatment of those with alcoholism is awful, and nobody should be treated like that. But for someone suffering from a medical condition like ABS, especially when they don't know, it must be terrible dealing with not only the stigma, but the accusations of doing something that you didn't even do. People with ABS may be trying their absolute hardest and doing everything they can, but intoxication episodes can still arise. When these episodes happen, they will be judged for something that's not in their control. Currently, there is not anything that completely cures Auto-Brewery Syndrome. Although some treatments can completely mitigate symptoms, there's still a risk of flare-ups. But things still didn't stop for Joe and Barbara after his diagnosis. They both did what they could do to help Joe get better, and Dr. McCarthy assisted with treating him and getting him back to a livable state. He did what would be considered the standard treatment right now for ABS. Typically, one needs to avoid carbs for 6 weeks, take a 6-week course of antifungal medication, and monitor blood alcohol throughout this period and afterwards. And that is exactly what Joe did. He was given 2 different types of antifungal medications over the course of 6 weeks. He made sure to abstain from sugars and carbs during treatment, and he also took a probiotic during this time, which is also said to help prevent relapses. Throughout this period, they tested his blood alcohol levels continuously, which fortunately for them remained at 0. And after a total of 10 weeks, they decided he was finally okay, and all they had to do lastly was treat him with an antibiotic to clear up an infection that had also grown with the yeast. Till this day, Joe has been doing well for about the past 13 years now. Even to this day, Barbara and Joe eat a bit healthier. They now make sure that there are lots of veggies in their diet, and Joe continued to be on a low carb diet for at least a year because keeping a balanced nutrition is also vital to prevent relapses. Barbara and Dr. McCarthy also became close colleagues. They went on to work together researching ABS, and they authored a scientific article. They're actually noted as being the first in the United States to identify the syndrome in somebody with no other major health problems and verify it in a controlled environment. That publication was also one of the ones that Michelle had come across when she was researching for Danny. Danny and Michelle were finally able to get married on April 29th, 2017. But even still after the diagnosis, Danny struggled pretty badly with ABS and its symptoms. He was vomiting for hours before and after the wedding, and he blacked out as soon as they got back to the hotel. He was shortly admitted to the hospital for pancreatitis right after. And the couple was unfortunately forced to cancel their honeymoon. Part of Danny's problem was that they had begun treatment before identifying the type of microorganism in his gut. He did have the common brewer's yeast that was associated with ABS, but he also had Candida intermedia, which was resistant to the medication that he had been given. Thus, they needed to figure out a better method to treat him, and they did have some ideas. A newer and less researched treatment for ABS is the fecal transplant. And a fecal transplant is exactly what it sounds like. It's taking feces from a healthy individual to transplant it into a patient with ABS. The healthy person's feces should contain the healthy bacteria from their gut biome that the patient with ABS is missing, and this can restore the balance of their microbiome. This is typically done through a colonoscopy, and although this has proved successful in some patients, more research is still needed. The doctors had discussed the idea of fecal transplants with Danny, but they eventually ended up giving him IV antifungal treatment called mycofungin sodium. Throughout his treatment, Danny's doctors kept in contact with Barbara, and she gave them tips and advice as she was extremely knowledgeable on the topic and willing to help. And while Danny did have a few flare-ups during this time, after a few weeks of this more appropriate treatment, he finally became symptom-free and returned to a much healthier state. He had normal blood sugars, he ended up losing 22 pounds from decreased swelling, and he finally had a blood alcohol level of 0. He began speaking out about ABS in 2017, where he advocated for patients and shared his story of the 14 months it had taken him to be diagnosed. Danny remained healthy and symptom-free, at least until 2019. Sadly, on November 9th, 2020, Danny had passed away unexpectedly and unrelated to the ABS. Michelle went on to become editor-in-chief of the ABS support group they were in, and in this position, she contacts every new member, offers to chat and help offline as much as she can. And she even created a new member welcome document to summarize information. Michelle has continued to help greatly with advocacy, contacting many hospitals and doctors and raising awareness for ABS. Barbara and Joe went on to found a nonprofit for Auto-Brewery Syndrome, Advocacy and Research. On July 20th, 2023, they even had a ribbon cutting ceremony to celebrate the beginning of the nonprofit. They used their nonprofit to help educate everyone they can on the syndrome and to raise money to continue ABS research. And what's awesome is that Michelle even decided to join them in on this endeavor. Barbara serves as the president of the organization, which is a role that allows her to advocate for people herself, and she's often in contact with patients, doctors, and even lawyers. And as mentioned, she is Dr. Barbara Cordell and holds a PhD in health counseling, which she definitely puts to good work in this role. Joe serves as the secretary and treasurer of the nonprofit. This role allows Joe to raise funds to help others who are going through similar circumstances to him, and he also makes sure to keep the nonprofit focused and on track. Michelle serves as the vice president and patient advocate. She continues her work talking to patients and their caregivers, and she's always ready to listen to the needs of her group and help any way that she can. Their website provides informative articles on ABS, a list of providers that have treated ABS, and the current news on ABS. Additionally, their social media allows a place for patients and their families to talk and share their insights. Barbara also went on to write the book My Gut Makes Alcohol: The Signs and Stories of Auto-Brewery Syndrome. The book includes her and Joe's story, Michelle and Danny's story, as well as a few others, information about the syndrome, and a call to action for the future of ABS. The proceeds from her book, Barbara uses to donate to fund research and advocacy for ABS. But yes, that is it for this case. We definitely thought it would be great to do a deep dive into ABS to hopefully help others out. Barbara was so kind to send her book to help in the research of this case, and I'll put the link to their nonprofit and book in the description. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mystery. Bye now.